In February of 2014, I found out I was pregnant. This was a planned pregnancy. It was my second pregnancy. But I still experienced it as a surprise because you never know whether you'll be able to get pregnant or how long it will take. My husband, Alex, and I were very excited. Having done this once before, I could picture the coming year. I pictured my summer at the swimming pool with a big pregnant belly. I pictured my fall classes canceled. I pictured the arrival of my November baby. My little daughter, who I already had, who was 3.5, Annie, meeting the new baby. I saw what was to come, and I knew that I had a living human being in my body. And I loved that little human, the beginning stage of my child. That's the kind of love I want to talk about today. Love of the fetus from the very beginning of pregnancy, from the very beginning of knowing that one is pregnant. In lecture 1, I talked about a very different attitude that pregnant girls and women can have to their fetuses. I talked about women and girls who want to abort their fetuses, who want to kill them, who do not love their fetuses, but anticipate that if forced to turn their fetuses into babies, they will love them. In lecture 1, I said, let's assume that abortion is morally permissible. And let's assume that there isn't even any strong moral reason against abortion. Today, I want us to face the question of the moral permissibility of abortion and the moral status of the fetus head on. I also want us to try to find a way to reconcile the reasonableness of the girls and women who don't love their fetuses at all and the girls and women who already love their fetuses from the very beginning of knowing that they are pregnant. The central claim I want to make, that I want to spend the talk taking seriously, is a claim that has an empirical component and a normative component. So the empirical claim is that it's common for pregnant women and girls to love their fetus from the very beginning of pregnancy. I don't claim that every pregnant person who's planning to continue her pregnancy feels this way. I know that's not true. But I think it is common that a pregnant woman already loves the fetus that she understands to be the beginning stage of her child. The normative claims are that in loving one's early fetus, as I did, one is not being irrational or unreasonable, and one is not caught in a false view about which kinds of things are appropriate objects of love. So these are the central claims that I propose we take seriously today and think about what follows from them. There is an anti-abortion argument that can be built on these claims. I don't think this argument succeeds, but I want us to look at this argument and talk about it and talk about how we might try to resist it. I will ultimately offer a way of resisting it. This is the anti-abortion argument. Premise 1, we start with the claims I've already made. Premise 1, some people love their fetuses from the very beginning of pregnancy, of knowing that they're pregnant. They are reasonable in loving their fetuses, and they are not making a mistake about which kinds of things are appropriate objects of love. Premise 2. If something is an appropriate object of love, something that makes sense to love, you're not making a fundamental mistake in loving that kind of thing, then it has moral status. It counts morally for its own sake, and it is a member of the moral community. I think this claim is true. But if early fetuses are appropriate objects of love, and appropriate objects of love have moral status, it follows that all early human fetuses have moral status. But it's also true that abortion greatly harms the fetus. Abortion kills the fetus. Abortion deprives the fetus of life as a person, a huge loss. Something that greatly harms a being with moral status has a strong moral reason against it. So it turns out that there is a strong moral reason against abortion. So this is the anti-abortion argument that I want us to think about. It starts with the reasonableness of loving a fetus from the very beginning, and it ends by saying there's a strong moral reason against abortion. How can we resist this argument? I want to encourage everybody to take a moment and think about what objection you would raise to the argument, and just make a little note to yourself with a pen or a pencil. Let's start by objecting to claim 2. This objection says, look, there are just lots of things that it makes perfect sense to love that we do love. We're not making mistakes in loving them, but they're not things that have moral status. Think about that plant that you have at work that you've taken such good care of, and you've really nursed it back to health that one time, and you are so attached to it, and you love that plant. But that plant isn't a member of the moral community. It doesn't count in its own right. There might be a song that you love. In recent years, a song that I really love is the Taylor Swift song Exile, which is about a breakup. I don't really identify with it from my own life, but my friends' divorces, it really speaks to those. You might have a favorite book, or just a book that you love. It doesn't have to be your favorite. Janet and I were talking about how we love the books of Jane Austen. And for myself, I can say I really love Pride and Prejudice. There might be a movie that you love. When Annie was little, she really loved this stuffed animal. He's a stuffed monkey, and creatively, his name is Monkey. She loved him so deeply. So these are all things that we love: a plant, a song, a book, a movie, a stuffed animal. We're not making any mistakes in loving these things. It's appropriate, our love for them, but they're not things that count morally. They're not members of the moral community. Okay, so the objection goes. And here, I think, on behalf of the anti-abortion argument, what we should say is that the objection prompts a useful clarification of what the argument is saying. So there's just different kinds of love. And premise 2 of the argument has to be we have to understand it as about interpersonal love for persons, as opposed to love for things. And of course, then we also have to understand claim 1 as the claim that the kind of love that women have for early fetuses is this interpersonal love, which I think is correct. We also have it towards animals, but I call it interpersonal love. Now, I'm not going to give a full account of love and these different kinds of love, but I just want to say a couple things about it. I think that both love of persons and love of things involves attachment to the thing you love. I think it involves some desire that the loved thing thrive or be preserved. But love for a person involves more than that. It involves concern for their well-being for their sake. And I've been convinced by Nico Kolodny that in loving someone, part of what's going on is that you're valuing your relationship with them, so that when you love someone, that love is partly about you. It's about your relationship with them. We should say, too, of course, that there are different kinds of interpersonal love. The kind of love that you feel for a friend differs in important ways from the love for a romantic partner, both of which differ from love for a parent or love for a child. But I still think that interpersonal love has certain things in common, like this. As a side note, I'll say there's an interesting challenge to the idea that love involves valuing your relationship with someone from the phenomenon of love at first sight. So if you love someone at first sight, surely that's possible. You don't have a relationship yet. So how could you be valuing a relationship? One way of understanding what's happening is that in loving someone at first sight, you anticipate a relationship that you value. Perhaps this is also what happens when an adoptive parent loves their newly adopted child right away. So the lesson from this objection to claim 2 is that the anti-abortion argument has to be understood as talking specifically about love, the kind of love that we feel for persons, interpersonal love, and we sometimes also feel it for animals. That's the kind of love that we have to be talking about in premises 1 and 2. Don't turn the page yet. I saw you do it. Let's keep looking at the argument on page 1 for another moment. As I've said, I think premise 1 is true. People really do love their fetuses from the beginning of pregnancy, and they're not irrational or unreasonable or making a mistake about what kinds of things are appropriate objects of love. I also think that premise 2 is true. Something is an appropriate object of love only if it's a member of the moral community. Surely claim 4 is true. Abortion greatly harms the fetus. Some people have tried to deny this in trying to defend abortion, and I think that is not a fruitful effort. I think if 3 and 4 are true, that 5 must also be true. So where can we object to this argument? All that's left is to object to the move from claims 1 and 2 to claim 3. And notice that claim 1 talks only about some early fetuses. If claim 1 is true, then some early fetuses are appropriate objects of love, and then claim 2 tells us of those fetuses that they have moral status. So really all that claims 1 and 2 show is that some early fetuses have moral status. Now you're allowed to turn the page. So let's object to the inference from claims 1 and 2 to claim 3 by saying, look, all that follows from 1 and 2 is that some fetuses have moral status. I'm going to talk about 2 different ways of developing an objection along these lines. One way of developing this objection is to say that loving something gives it moral status, that love endows moral status. And there are reasons to think that this is so. Consider a mountain that is worshipped by an indigenous community. They consider the mountain sacred. And now you go hiking on the mountain. There are certain things that you shouldn't do, ways that you should engage with the mountain, simply because of the way it is worshipped and considered sacred by this indigenous community. They've changed how the mountain counts morally. In some religions, there are physical books that are sacred, and there are certain ways that the books should be treated. And if you are not a member of that religion, you still have reasons to treat those books carefully in the way that the adherents to the religion would have you do. And we come back to Annie's monkey. Her drawing of monkey is on the handout. I can't tell you what a faithful drawing this is. This really is. There's monkey. Annie loved monkey so deeply, and we used to say, monkey is a member of the family. And we kind of meant it. We had reasons to treat monkey much differently than any other stuffed animals. We have reasons to treat the sacred books differently, to treat the mountain differently. So perhaps loving something gives it moral status. But I think there are two serious problems with this view. One problem is that moral status should be a matter of something's intrinsic qualities. It should not be determined by something so extrinsic as how other beings feel about you. I think that's a very serious problem for this view. Another problem is that there are certain cases in which someone genuinely cares about an entity, and yet it's just clear that they haven't managed to give it moral status. Suppose a woman in the United States is pregnant, and she goes to an abortion clinic and there are protesters outside. And one of the protesters shouts at her, "I love your fetus." He is speaking truly. He really cares about her fetus, and he's really upset at her plans to harm it, which he discerns because this is why women come to this clinic. His care for the fetus is genuine, and yet it doesn't make the fetus matter in a way that it didn't already matter. I think these two problems are decisive against the view that loving something gives it moral status. I think that love does not endow moral status. I think we can explain our reasons to treat the mountain differently, to treat the books differently, to treat monkey as special, just by thinking about how in treating these things we are treating the people who care about them. And the source of our reasons is the way that these people matter, and not that they've brought the things to matter. Okay, so I think that won't work. But remember, we're trying to object to the anti-abortion argument by objecting to the move from claims 1 and 2 to claim 3, which involves, and we resist the argument by saying, look, it's just that some fetuses have moral status, not all fetuses. And now I want to give us a different way to do that. So the claim that I want to make is that among early fetuses, and I want to talk about early fetus to mean preconscious fetuses. Among preconscious fetuses, I claim we actually have two very different kinds of things. Some early fetuses die without ever being conscious. They're living beings, they have no experiences. They're a lot like plants. Some early fetuses are the beginning stages of persons. Some early fetuses are the beginning stages of conscious experiencers. That's a very different kind of thing, I claim, even back before they start having experiences. So I offer the following view, the ever-conscious view. A living thing has moral status just in case it is ever conscious. So the view says a living thing has moral status throughout its life, just in case there is any moment in its life at which it is conscious. On this view, each of you has had moral status from the moment you came into existence as an embryo and then an early fetus. On this view, the early fetuses that die in early abortions lack moral status because they are things that never have any experiences, are never conscious. On this view, the deaths of fetuses in early abortions are deaths of things that don't matter morally, and there's no moral reason against abortion. And so this is how I claim we can reject the anti-abortion argument, by saying that among early fetuses we have very different types of things. Some are appropriate objects of love, others do not, and they have moral status. Others do not matter morally. So we can acknowledge that some early fetuses are the appropriate objects of love without conceding that there's any reason against early abortion. So this is, I think, the right way to reject the anti-abortion argument. And now, that's the end of my discussion of the anti-abortion argument. But I want to move forward by saying that the anti-abortion argument is pushing a certain kind of objection against abortion, and it's in a family of objections against abortion. And I want to look more broadly at that family of objections. And these are objections that suggest that we just shouldn't take a cold attitude towards all early fetuses. And I want to talk about how we can continue to think that nothing morally bad happens in an early abortion while dealing with these objections. So the view of abortion that I hold, that I want to defend, is the very liberal view of abortion. That abortion of early preconscious fetuses that abortions are morally insignificant, early abortions, and require no moral justification. So what we've talked about so far is what we might think of as the love objection to this view, which holds that pregnant women who love their fetuses aren't unreasonable or making any kind of mistake about what kinds of things are appropriate objects of love. Another objection is the harm objection, which says, think about women early in pregnancy who are planning to continue their pregnancies. They have reasons not to harm their fetuses. They should not smoke excessively. They should not drink alcohol excessively. If they're considering taking a medicine that would cause birth defects in the fetus, they have a strong reason not to do that. When we think about our reasons against harming the fetus, it really seems like it's because this living being matters. That's the harm objection. In March of 2014, I was in Bowling Green, Ohio, giving a philosophy talk. I was giving a talk about the ethics of abortion, as I had many times before. I was defending a very liberal view of abortion, as I had many times before. But I was pregnant, and I was bleeding. As I said that early fetuses that die in abortions don't matter morally. I didn't know whether my fetus was dying, was dead, or was fine. As I talked about an objection from miscarriage, I didn't know whether I was miscarrying. A week later, at home, an ultrasound revealed that I had miscarried. My husband and I went out for a drink, the first drink I'd had in months. It was the saddest date we've ever had. And then we picked up our little 3-year-old Annie from preschool. For years, I had talked about how women who have miscarriages, even early miscarriages, can find it devastating. But I didn't have any idea how I would react, and it was surprising to me how devastated I was. I had felt I knew what the year to come held: the swimming pool, the fall classes canceled, the November baby, and I couldn't really get a grip on the actual reality I found myself in. My husband Alex knew, but I chose not to tell people, and so I was sad all by myself. Almost. For years, people had said that my view was cold and insensitive to women who experienced miscarriage, and now I was one of the people to whom my view was supposedly cold and insensitive. I planned a long trip to Australia, and in the summer, I left Alex and Annie and went to Australia. I gave some philosophy talks. I went to the Sydney Opera House and I climbed through the backstage on a special tour for theater nerds because I had been a theater nerd. I told myself that travel would be my consolation for not having a second baby. The miscarriage objection says it's understandable to be very upset by a miscarriage, even an early miscarriage, and I think that's true. A related objection is the regret objection. Women who have chosen to abort often feel some regret about their abortion, though they don't wish they'd chosen differently. They don't regret the choice to abort, but they still feel some regret. How can we understand this except as recognition of the value, the moral significance of the life that was lost? So those are 4 objections to the very liberal view of abortion: objections from love, harm, miscarriage, and regret. All of these objections push us not to take a cold attitude to early fetuses. I want to convince you that the very liberal view of abortion can be defended in the face of all of these objections, and that the ever-conscious view helps. Regarding love, I've already said how this works. According to the ever-conscious view, some early fetuses are the appropriate objects of love. And so we vindicate the love that women have for their early fetuses. Regarding harm, according to the ever-conscious view, some early fetuses really do have moral status. They really are sources of reasons against harm. The ever-conscious view also helps us to make sense of some of what's hard about miscarriage. According to the ever-conscious view, it's reasonable to love your fetus from the very beginning of pregnancy as I did, thinking that your fetus is the beginning stage of your child. If your fetus was the beginning stage of your child, it would be an appropriate object of love. If you love a living being and then that being dies, that can be devastating. And that is what miscarriage is for some women. The death of a being, not only that they loved, but that they were reasonable in loving, according to the ever-conscious view. There's another thing that I think is important to say about miscarriage that doesn't rely on the ever-conscious view, it's just another thing to say, which is, and this also is relevant to the regret objection, our pregnancies present to us, vividly present to us, a possibility in which we become a parent to a new child now. And it is because we are pregnant, it is a close possibility. Miscarriage takes that possibility away, and we can understand a lot of the sadness and loss of miscarriages as a loss for the pregnant person, a loss of the life that she would have had she become a mother to a new child at this time. Similarly, in abortion, even if one chooses to forego the life in which one has a new child at this time, one may well see the features of that life that would be wonderful and meaningful, even while ultimately choosing against it. And the loss of the life for yourself, the life that you would have had you continued the pregnancy, can explain some regret, even when one does not regret the choice overall. Okay, so what I've done so far in this talk is I've talked about the love that some women have for their fetuses from the very beginning of pregnancy, an anti-abortion argument that takes that love and says it shows that there's a strong moral reason against all early abortion. I've argued that we can resist that argument by adopting the ever-conscious view, which holds that among early fetuses, we have different kinds of things, some of which have moral status and some of which don't. And I've argued that the ever-conscious view is actually helpful in also answering objections to a liberal view of abortion from harm and miscarriage. So I want to talk a little bit more about the ever-conscious view for the final part of the talk. And so now we're at the top of page 3. And I've put the ever-conscious view there again, just so we can have it in mind while I talk through some objections. So the ever-conscious view says, a living thing has moral status just in case it is ever conscious. I want to talk about 4 objections. The first objection says, look, a fetus's moral status is determined by its nature. It should be an intrinsic matter. But according to the ever-conscious view, you can have 2 fetuses that are just alike, and one has moral status and one doesn't. To answer this, I want us to compare the ever-conscious view to another view we might have, which is the mother's intention view. So on this view, if the pregnant woman intends to continue her pregnancy, then the fetus has moral status. If the pregnant woman intends to abort, then the fetus lacks moral status. This view has the great advantage that it can say to women who miscarry, yes, your fetus mattered. It was the death of a being who mattered. But the problem with this view is seen when we think about a case where the pregnant woman keeps changing her mind. So suppose that a pregnant woman is sure she's going to continue her pregnancy on one day and the fetus has moral status on that day. The next day she is sure she's going to abort and the fetus lacks moral status on that day. The next day she is sure that she's going to continue and the fetus has moral status. On this view, the fetus fluctuates in whether it has moral status, but really nothing about the fetus itself changes. And moral status can't be like that. On the ever-conscious view, a being's intrinsic properties do determine its moral status, but we have to look at its intrinsic properties throughout its life. What we need to embrace the ever-conscious view is the thought that a thing's nature is determined by its life as a whole. A second objection says, look, if the ever-conscious view were true, we'd never know whether an early fetus has moral status. How would we know? So I want to say three things about this objection. First, we really do know about some early fetuses that they're going to die as early fetuses. If the woman who's pregnant plans to abort, and we have every reason to think she'll be able to get an abortion, then we can know that her fetus lacks moral status. Can we know that an early fetus has moral status? I actually don't think we can because miscarriage rates are sufficiently high. If a woman is planning to continue her pregnancy, she can know that more likely than not, her fetus is the beginning stage of her child. She can reasonably believe that it's the beginning stage of her child. I think it is reasonable to love an early fetus, even without knowledge that it's the beginning stage of your child. You might well think, some women may think, I want to love my child from the very beginning. But even without that thought, you just may find yourself loving the fetus in the knowledge that it's very likely the beginning stage of your child. The final thing I want to say about this objection is that sometimes we won't know. Sometimes we just won't know whether an early fetus, we'll have no idea whether an early fetus has moral status. But that's okay. We find ourselves in situations often enough in which there's something morally important, some matter of fact that's morally important that we don't know. And we know how to act. Sometimes we have to be cautious because of what we don't know. If a woman doesn't know whether her fetus is going to become a person and she's offered a drug that would cause a birth defect, she has a serious reason against taking the drug because her fetus may have moral status, for example. A third objection asks us not to think about the beginning of human life, but to think about the end of human life. Suppose there's a person who's had a full life, and then they become unconscious, and indeed they become permanently unconscious, but they are still alive. The objection says, according to the ever-conscious view, that living, permanently unconscious human has moral status, but then we'd have to keep them alive, and surely we shouldn't keep them alive, so something's gone wrong. The view can't be right. In response to this objection, I want to say, yes, it's true that on this view, the ever-conscious view, a permanently unconscious living human being who had a full life and is now permanently unconscious does have moral status. But it doesn't follow that we need to keep them alive. It may well be that the best way to honor their moral status and treat them well is to let them die. Finally, a fourth objection. According to the ever-conscious view, you just can't lose. If you abort, then it turns out that the fetus you aborted was the kind of thing it's okay to abort. If you don't abort, then it turns out that the fetus was the kind of thing it's not okay to abort. Good thing you didn't abort. The But then abortion is self-justifying. And the objector says, surely abortion isn't self-justifying. Abortion isn't okay because you aborted. So again, the view can't be right. What I want to say in response to this is that the objector is right that if you abort, according to the ever-conscious view, you haven't done anything wrong. You can't lose in that sense. But the objector is wrong to think that in the cases in which you don't abort, it's true in those cases that abortion is wrong. To explain how I see this, I want to talk about how we find our reasons against harming, our harm-based moral reasons. So I think that the objector is assuming a bad model of how we find our harm-based reasons, in which we first ask which things have moral status, and then ask, would this action harm any of them? And if it would, then we have a harm-based reason. So that's what the objector is thinking. They're thinking, take a fetus that has moral status. So when we ask which things have moral status, the fetus is on the list. And now, now we say, well, we're not aborting it, but had we aborted it, that would have harmed the fetus, so there's a strong harm-based reason against it. Let me explain why the bad model is a bad model. I call it the bad model to be clear that I think it's a bad model. Suppose that I'm in danger of creating a child who would have a brief life of misery. I should not create this child. I've promised to meet you for lunch, but it turns out that my only way of preventing myself from creating the miserable child is to stand you up. I'm a good person, so I stand you up for lunch and I prevent myself from creating the miserable child. Then you come to me and you say, Liz, you promised to meet me for lunch. I hope you had a good reason for breaking your promise. And I say, yes, I had a good reason. And then we go looking for the reason. We first ask, well, which things have moral status? And we list all the actual people and animals. And then we ask, would my keeping my promise to you have harmed any of those things? Well, if I'd kept my promise to you, I would have created the miserable child who would have suffered. But they're not on the list. I didn't create them. So we can't find the reason, the harm-based reason that I did have to break the promise. Suppose instead that we adopt the good model. This is the one that I think is right, that's why I call it the good model. The good model of how we find our harm-based moral reasons. We first ask regarding an action, would this action harm anything? And then we ask, would that thing or those things have had moral status? So, would my keeping my promise to you and meeting you for lunch have harmed anything? Well, yeah. Had I met you for lunch, I would have created the miserable child who would have suffered. That would have been a result of my action, so I would have harmed the child in causing their suffering. Would the child have had moral status? Of course, it would have been a suffering being. It would have had moral status. So we found our reason. That's the reason that I had to break my promise to you. So let's use the good model in thinking about what the ever-conscious view says. Here we are with a fetus that actually has moral status, a fetus that isn't going to be aborted. And we ask, well, in this world where we don't abort the fetus, is it wrong to abort the fetus? Well, had it been aborted, would the abortion have harmed anything? Yes, it would have harmed this fetus. Would the fetus have had moral status? No, it would not have. So there's no reason against aborting. Another way of putting this point that I'm making in response to the objection is that the following is not true. Look at the things that have moral status. Actions that would harm them have reasons against them. Not in all cases, because some things that have moral status might have lacked moral status. But what we have reasons against are actions that, if performed, would be a harming of something that has moral status. Okay, so in conclusion, we've been talking about love of early fetuses from the very beginning. What does this love teach us about abortion? Does it teach us that there's a strong moral reason against abortion, as the anti-abortion argument urged? I've argued it does not. Does it teach us that some early fetuses have a moral status? I think it does, because I think premises 1 and 2 of that argument are true. And it's not just love that teaches us that. Besides the fact that some early fetuses are the appropriate objects of love, there's also the fact that some early fetuses shouldn't be harmed because of the way they already matter, and the fact that it's understandable to be very upset by an early miscarriage, which points us back to the idea that fetuses are appropriate objects of love. I think these facts together teach us that some early fetuses have moral status. Today, I told you the story of my miscarriage, and that is a story of something sad that happened to me. But it's also part of a bigger story, the story of my husband, Alex, and me trying to have a second child, trying to make a baby. And that's a happier story. I did get my November baby just a year later than I thought. My Rosie, who's 8 years old now. Making a baby, that's what lecture 3 is going to be about. When does love make a baby? Thanks.
So my name's Tom Sinclair. So thanks. I'm interested in the idea that love teaches us something about the moral status of the fetus. And I'm just trying to understand the way it does that on your picture. And so I'm thinking about a scenario in which, a kind of dystopian scenario in which some group of women are known never to be able to bring their pregnancies to term. And they will be forced to have abortions always before the fetus becomes conscious. And yeah, it seems to me quite likely that these women might love any fetuses they come to conceive. And I would have thought that love's the same as the love that you say commonly people feel and teaches us about the moral status of the fetus. So I'm trying to make those two things hang together.
Okay, thanks. So the question is, what if there was a group of women who can't physically carry a pregnancy to term, and so there's a kind of heavy-handed medical system that imposes abortion on them, regardless of whether they choose it for themselves. And so they know that if they get pregnant, their pregnancies will be ended before the fetuses are ever conscious. So the question is, mightn't they love their fetuses and mourn the losses of their fetuses? And if love teaches us stuff, doesn't that teach us that even preconscious fetuses have moral status? Great. So when I said that love teaches us stuff, what did I mean? Because really what's ending up doing a lot of work here are normative claims about love. So the mere fact of people loving their fetuses, if it were true that whenever people love their fetuses, that's reasonable, then that's reasonable and appropriate. Then the case that you're raising would be one that shows that even preconscious fetuses have moral status. But that's not what I think. So I think that seeing actual love prompts us to make normative judgments, and then it's a substantive normative claim that the love that many women have for their early fetuses is reasonable, and that in particular they're not making a mistake about what kinds of things are appropriate objects of love. some emotional experiences of pregnancy that some women have that I'm not in a position to vindicate. You know, there are women who will have an early miscarriage and then hold a funeral because they think that their fetus was a person whose death should be mourned like any person. And I'm not vindicating that, and I feel for them, but I do think that they're getting something wrong. Thanks.
Okay, you made several claims.
This is Jeff McMahon.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jeff McMahon. Yeah. The ever conscious view says that the fetus has moral status just in case it is ever conscious. Claim later on that the permanently non-conscious individual was conscious and therefore has moral status. You say it's not irrational to love an early fetus because this is the early stage, early phase of one's child. You also, in the course of the talk, referred to from the beginning of pregnancy, from the moment an individual comes into existence as an embryo or early fetus. So what I'm suggesting here is these claims that I quoted to begin with presuppose identity. That is to say, you say the early fetus or the embryo only if it is ever conscious. Well, it's got to be it that's conscious later on. So there's got to be a relation of identity between the embryo and the later conscious individual. There's got to be a relation of identity between the permanently non-conscious human body and the previous person. And I also think it wouldn't make sense to feel love for an entity that was not one and the same thing as the later child, but was some precursor. So it would be a mistake, for example, to feel love for a sperm cell or an egg cell. So what I'm suggesting here is your claims about, from the beginning of pregnancy, presuppose a view about identity, that we begin to exist at conception or something, and that presupposes a particular kind of conception of the kind of thing that we are.
Yep.
It's, I think, incompatible with the most common views about what kind of thing we are when we begin to exist. I mean, even the view that we are animals, I think, implies that we don't begin to exist until about 2 weeks after conception when there's already an embryo there, or something like that. In other words, pregnancy begins before I think there's an organism present. Certainly, your claims don't hold of early fetuses and embryos if we begin to exist at the period corresponding, what we call brain life, which corresponds to brain death, or on other views that claim that the capacity for consciousness is essential to our existence, or if there are Parfit's early view that we are effectively that we're essentially persons, which implies that we don't begin to exist until there's quite a bit of substantial psychological connectedness from day to day within the life. So
Thanks.
pre-conscious fetuses would never be things that could become conscious on any of these views.
Thank you, Jeff. So the question is, haven't I presupposed a very implausible view about identity of persons over time? So I said that we were once early preconscious fetuses. Already in saying that, I said that you were once a preconscious fetus. Already I've ruled out lots of views that philosophers hold. Jeff thinks they're the going views. And then there's also a question about when, even if we were early fetuses, were we really ever embryos? That's another question that Jeff raised. So, in Jeff's view, is this right, Jeff, that we are embodied minds? And so you and I didn't come into existence on Jeff's view until there was some consciousness there. Okay, so that's right, Jeff. I am relying on the view that we were once early fetuses. I think that's the common sense view. I think it's true. I do think that we're animals, so if Jeff is right that really animals are never early embryos, I'm not sure what the explanation would be, but maybe it's that you don't really have an animal until the various cells are kind of working in a coordinated manner, and you don't have that right away. I've got a nod from Chris. So that's fine. I'm fine with that. So once you've got a coordinated activity, then you have an animal. So maybe that's when we started to exist. I'm unsympathetic to the view that the mere possibility of twinning means that we don't exist until after the possibility of twinning has passed. I think if there isn't actual twinning, then we exist from, like, during the phase that in theory we might have twinned. So yes, so I am assuming or relying on or saying, I'm saying that we were once fetuses. I'm saying that we are not essentially persons. I'm saying that we do not essentially have moral status. You matter morally. You might not have mattered. So that is the picture that I'm offering. Jeff also mentioned Parfit's view and the idea that Parfit thought we were essentially persons. But it's interesting because if you are convinced by Parfit that what really matters morally in our survival isn't identity, I think you can let go. Like, it's not important to say that we're essentially persons. But anyway, thanks, Jeff. You are right that those are the commitments that are part of this view. Oh my God, Hannah, I pronounce your last name wrong. I'm gonna work on it. Well, I'm never gonna say it that way again, so go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Love things and interpersonal love. And I wasn't sure whether that distinction a distinction in love, both of which will be reasonable, between the woman who loves the embryo, if the embryo is aborted or spontaneously miscarries or is destroyed by medical establishment, and the love a woman feels for the embryo is something with moral status because it lives, and so becomes conscious, but therefore has moral status from the beginning. So I wasn't sure whether that distinction between the objects of the mothers, those two different mothers' love, was supposed to track the thing interpersonal distinction, or whether somehow both of those mothers' love fell within the interpersonal distinction. We just had something important there, right? At least for some people, which is a kind of interpersonal love we feel for being moral status, and a kind of interpersonal love we feel for being lack moral status, but which are still weakness. So the first
Thanks.
question is just to say a little bit more about the shape of different kinds of love. But I guess sort of in the background is this question, which is a real question for me. I speak as one who's not had a miscarriage, and people have different experiences,
Yeah.
but I take very seriously the devastation. Whether when you thought the articulation of the landscape of different kinds of love, like what it is about the experience you see yourself as able to vindicate,
Yeah.
and what it is, at least about some people's experience, that you might feel you're unable to vindicate.
Thanks. Thank you, Hannah. So Hannah asked two questions. I think I'm going to start by talking about Hannah's second question. Hannah Pickard. That's who asked the question.
I'm really going to ask about how it's
Well, it's good to learn. You learn lots of different things giving talks. So the second question that Hannah asked is, I've acknowledged that I'm not going to vindicate all of the emotional experiences that women may have during pregnancy and miscarriage? And could I just say more about which experiences I am in a position to vindicate and which I'm not? So I'm going to start by talking about about my own experience of miscarriage, because ultimately I came to feel that my philosophical view did capture my emotional experience, that in particular there was this life path that I thought I was on, and it was very, very hard to accept that I wasn't on that path of having the second baby at that time. And that it really, I think in my emotional life, it really was a sorrow about my not having that life, and Alex and Annie not having that at that time. And of course I didn't know if I would get to have a second baby later. I think there was also, so another aspect of my experience that my actual philosophical views vindicate is this reorientation of attitude towards the fetus. So I really thought this is the beginning stage of my child, and I loved the fetus, and then I was like, oh, I was just wrong about what kind of thing that was. But it's all emotionally hard to make that readjustment. And so those things, I think, were vindicated. But you can imagine someone who so I talked already about the woman who has the early miscarriage and it holds the funeral, and I just can't vindicate. She thinks this is like losing a child, you know, and I mourn for the child, and I don't vindicate that. My view doesn't say she's getting that right. My view says there's something that she's mistaken about. But there can be lesser versions of that I'm still not vindicating. So someone who thinks, you know, feels badly for the fetus about the early miscarriage, my view does not vindicate that sentiment. My view does not say, right, we should feel bad for the sake of the fetus. I do think the fetus loses a tremendous amount. It is really bad for the fetus, but I don't think that the fetus matters. And so I think that it is a mistake to feel bad for the fetus. So I think there are lots of common experiences that I'm not vindicating. Okay, and then Hannah's first question was, I think it's really important to get clear on this. So I talked about love of things, and I talked about love of persons, and there's two different things that I might have been doing. One thing that I might have been saying is, we can tell what kind of love it is by what the object is. So whenever you're loving something that isn't really a person or an animal that counts, then what you're engaged in is love of things, that kind of love. But when you love something that really counts morally, that's interpersonal love. If that was what I was doing, then it would turn out that women who loved their fetuses and then miscarried, had early miscarriages, they thought they were doing the interpersonal love thing, but really what they felt was love of things. And that's not what I want to say. So what I want to say is that there's two different kinds of love, attitudes that we can have. One is an attitude that we typically have towards things, and there'll be varieties within that. And another is an attitude that we typically have towards persons and maybe our pets. And that's what I'm calling interpersonal love. So my claim is definitely that women who love their fetuses from the very beginning and then miscarry, that they feel that interpersonal love that I felt, that interpersonal love, that motherly love for my fetus. And then I discovered that my fetus was an inappropriate object of that love. But I hadn't been making a mistake in principle because I had thought that my fetus was the beginning stage of my child. So I had made a mistake in fact that my fetus wasn't the beginning stage of my child. Thanks, Hannah.
Well, this is perfect because it's a follow-up to Hannah's question, which is basically just a repeat of Tom's question. But I think I'm just going to do the service of
And then you answer that by making this kind of type 2, basically saying something like, conditions of reasonability don't have to do with the appropriateness of that particular object, it rather has to do with something about its being one of a kind, the kind of thing that could have that status for all the woman knows. So for you, it's a really important thing that there's an epistemic statement. But then Tom's worry against you. Well, what if a woman knows that there is no way that she's inherent this? Then it seems that can't hold on. I mean, another way you could go though is remove the epistemic uncertainty requirement. So it's not so much about, oh well, for all she knows, this could be the kind of thing, or sorry, not this could be the kind of thing. This will have more, or rather just make it a kind of type 2 issue. So then reasonableness is not about whether this particular object does have moral status, or rather whether it's sometimes have moral status.
Thanks.
Otherwise, I think Tom's issues are.
Thank you, Amia. So Amia asks, is this, so first of all, is this the picture that, in my view, the only early fetuses that really have moral status are the ones that have futures in which they're conscious. But some, in cases where a woman is pregnant and loves her fetus, but in fact she's going to miscarry, I said she's reasonable in loving her fetus, but this turns out to be crucially because of her epistemic situation. So that's right, Amia. It's because, given what she knows, she has good reason to think this is the beginning stage of her child. In my view, that's what makes it reasonable and not irrational. And that's why she's not making a deep mistake about which kinds of things are appropriate objects of love, because if her beliefs were correct, her fetus would be an appropriate object of love. Now, Amia says there's another way that we can go. And you remember during the talk, I said that the mother's intention view vindicates that fetuses that die in miscarriages really had moral status. So Amia also urges, is there some way of vindicating love of early fetuses, even without the epistemic component, even those that die early, as, for example, in the case we talked about in the first question, of women who are always having abortions forced upon them and nevertheless love their fetuses, knowing that the fetuses will die. And so, there definitely is a way to see some early fetuses as mattering morally because there are other early fetuses that survive, and that's the potentiality view. So this is a common view, that early fetuses have moral status because they have the potential to have exciting lives as cognitively sophisticated beings. And I think that view is false. I mean, it's definitely a view on which there are reasons against abortion. And one way of understanding what's happening in my offering my view is that I'm rejecting a potentiality view and adopting an actuality view instead. And I think sometimes some of the rhetoric that's used to support a potentiality view doesn't really support a potentiality view, but instead supports my actuality view. So people say things like, we have here the beginning stage of a person. But that's not true for all early fetuses. Many early fetuses are not the beginning stage of a person. There is no person such that they're the beginning stage of that person. Thanks. Oh yeah, you're supposed to get the microphone.
does that, is there a difference? If, for example, if the first embryo, if the first pregnancy holds, then she says, well, in that case, I'm going to throw away the second frozen embryo. Does that affect how she feels?
Okay, thanks. So the question is, how does all this look when we start thinking about in vitro fertilization as a way of making babies and frozen embryos? So one thing that we might notice is that if a woman gets pregnant with one embryo and then comes to love this early fetus, it might be true of her that just if the other one had been put in, she would have loved that one. So there's something kind of contingent about her loving this one. I think that's right, it can be contingent, and that's fine. But another thing we might wonder about is, well, what if there's a frozen embryo sitting there and that's your second kid who you're going to turn into a baby in 3 years? Am I saying it's okay to love the embryo now? Does anybody love the embryo now? Does my view imply that it makes sense to love the embryo now? Isn't that a little crazy, loving frozen embryos? So I think this is a good place to push. Interestingly, Jeff's question might help me out a little because who knows the answer to this? Are the frozen embryos sufficiently differentiated that if we think you need to be like a cooperative, okay, we got to know. Okay, so one idea, one thing that a person who held my view could say is that actually the frozen embryo stage, we don't exist yet because we haven't become like an animal yet because the cells haven't started differentiating. But suppose I don't take that view. Then, as a practical matter, I think it is hard to know about particular frozen embryos that they're even likely to become your kid because IVF fails sufficiently often. And so I think that'll be a bit of a block on the idea that it's going to be reasonable to love them. But it's easy enough to imagine cases where it's going to go well. And we might even actually have some cases where there's pretty good confidence. And then I think if anybody loved the embryo and they really were reasonable in thinking it had a good chance of being their kid, that would be okay with me. I'm happy to say that makes sense. I also want to say that we're going to talk more, as I was saying, about baby making next time. So we get to talk about in vitro fertilization next time. And I also want to say just about the lecture series. Today's journey through love and abortion relied on some work that I've previously published to some extent, and some of those citations are on the back of the handout. Next lecture does not do that. So in the next lecture, we're just going to talk about stuff that I haven't talked about before. I just wanted to give you a sense of how the lectures are organized. Thanks, Fiona.
Question is interesting.
Rachel Fraser. So you have these two objections to the loving something gives it moral status view. The moral status should be intrinsic objection, and the I love your fetus objection, which I'm kind of thinking of as the busybody objection. So I guess I'm wondering whether versions of both these objections don't apply to your view. So let's take the intrinsic thing first. So it seems like on fairly natural ways of thinking about intrinsicality and persistence, you can get views on which the fetus is such that it will be conscious, but this doesn't count as an intrinsic property of the fetus. So if you think the fetus is like a 3D slice of a 4D object, and things persist by being parts of 4D objects, then when we say the fetus will be conscious, we're saying something like the fetus is part of a 4D object, some of whose parts are conscious. And that sure doesn't sound like an intrinsic property of friction. So that's one thought. And then there's also this kind of the busybody thought. So, sure, it seems clear that the guy standing on the sidewalk who's yelling, I love your fetus, does not thereby give the woman any kind of weighty reason not to have anti-choice person imprisons me in his basement. And I say, let me out. I really want to have an abortion. And he says, well, you're going to be in here for the next week. And by that stage, your fetus will be conscious. So you have a really strong reason not to have an abortion. So there seems like, sure, like the anti-choice person is not doing well in imprisoning me in the basement. But more than that, it seems sort of wrong that they're imprisoning me in the basement could give me a genuine reason to refrain from having an abortion. But your view seems to predict that he can thereby give me such a reason.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, so Rachel asks two questions, and Rachel's two questions are versions of the objections that I made against the view that loving something gives it moral status. Rachel says that those objections work against my view too. So first I said, look, moral status should be intrinsic. And Rachel says, look, you know, if you look at the fetus now, it's not part of its current intrinsic nature what its future is like. And certainly on some metaphysical views, it's not. And so moral status isn't really intrinsic on your view, Liz. And I just want to agree. So I just want to say objects persist through time. We can talk about the intrinsic properties that they have throughout their lives. And what I'm saying is my view holds that moral status supervenes on that. I think part of what you're pressing is depending on your metaphysics, it's more or less troubling. Or it's more or less like extrinsic. And maybe that's right, but in any case, that is the view. You know, so the view is we're going to take seriously that objects persist through time, and that we persist through time, and then yeah, it's not as intrinsic as if you thought it was just the current intrinsic properties that make a difference. Okay, and then Rachel said, I had this objection that the anti-abortion protester, just in loving your fetus, can't give it moral status. But Rachel said, well, the anti-abortion protester can still give your fetus moral status, on my view. He just gives your fetus moral status by locking you up and preventing you from aborting until your fetus becomes conscious. But he shouldn't have that power, Rachel objects. Okay, so let's start by saying, of course, people have that power over other people, like Amy Coney Barrett of the US Supreme Court and her friends on that court have managed to imprison lots of women, not by literally imprisoning them, but by making it so hard for them to get abortions, by allowing states to make abortion illegal, that they have forced many women to have fetuses that turn out to have moral status by forcing them to turn their fetuses into babies. So we definitely have that power regarding other people. But you might be thinking something like, it's just so crazy that a week could make a difference, that it's going to go from lacking moral status to having moral status just because it starts being conscious. But you know, any view that thinks that we start off without moral status when at the beginning of fetal development and we have moral status by the end should think that moral status arises at some point. So I think that's okay too.
All right. Hi, I'm Aniket. Thanks so much for your talk. I wanted to go back to the question that started with Tom and has been bouncing back and forth. So the example I thought is, you know, a couple intend to have a baby and carry it to term, but then later on decide to abort the baby and the fetus, and so on your view, it seems like that retrospectively makes that love that they previously had at that time inappropriate. You know, you would probably say it's fine because for all they knew then, it was appropriate, but there's still, I mean, at least to me, seems to be like an intuitive sense that we want to maintain that all of those people at that same time, regardless of whether or not they'll later on change their minds, had the same kind of love towards their fetuses.
Okay, thanks. So the question is, what do I have to say about a case in which a couple finds that so a man and a woman are a couple, the woman becomes pregnant. Their first thought is that they're going to continue the pregnancy and they love the fetus in the way that I've been talking about. But then, they think about it more and they decide, they both decide that they would prefer that she abort, and she aborts. What do I have to say about this? So the objection is, surely their love was appropriate. But all that I'm going to say is that their love was reasonable, though it turns out it was inappropriate. So yeah, so I think partly it's helpful to clarify how I'm using these words. So I really am using reasonable and irrational to talk about what's true in light of what the agent's information was. And then for appropriate, I'm really trying to pick out, given the actual situation, whether this is an appropriate object of love. So if somebody is really deluded and they think that stuffed animals have morals, or count like people, but some guru has convinced them it's true, and they're sort of reasonable in believing the cult leader who convinced them. It's possible to imagine a case in which someone is reasonable in having, in which a grown-up is reasonable in having interpersonal love for a stuffed animal, but that stuffed animal is not an appropriate object of love. So I want to use appropriate to talk about whether the thing is actually an appropriate object of love, not anything epistemic. Thanks.
Yeah, shall I go? Thanks, Becky Brown. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about why something ever being conscious should give it moral status. It seems convenient for your argument, but is there more you can say?
Okay, great. So the question is, I've offered the ever-conscious view as a way of acknowledging as a way of vindicating love of fetuses from the very beginning and a way of escaping the anti-abortion argument. But I haven't really talked about why we should think the ever-conscious view is true, apart from the fact that it enables us to avoid taking a cold attitude towards all early fetuses while still saying that early fetuses that die in abortions lack moral status. So, of course, there's a lot to say about this. What I want to say here is what I've tried to urge today is that it makes sense to think that what kind of thing something is could be sensitive to its future. And that once we acknowledge that, we should think that it makes sense to think that the fact that something has a future in which it has properties that are themselves sufficient for moral status, that having a future of having those properties could be sufficient for already having moral status. And then there's the further question of whether that's consciousness. And just one thing that I'll mention is, you might ask, is it consciousness or is it the ability, so is it just any experience at all that's enough, or is it having positive and negative experiences that's enough? So that's just one variant of the ever-conscious view that I want to put before you. You might say, I like everything Liz said in the talk, but I don't want to go for the ever-conscious view. I want to go for a view on which it's ever having positive or negative experiences that's sufficient for moral status. And I haven't said anything to tell between those views.
So my name is Mikey, and so if I understood you correctly, you argued against the view that loving something gives it moral status by arguing that in fact the properties of the thing extended over its lifetime give it moral status, and more specifically, a living thing has moral status just in case it is ever conscious. So I was wondering, does it matter? Like, in what way? So this question comes in two parts, I suppose. So the first one is, does it matter for this view that in the case of abortion, we're the ones making the thing never conscious? And specifically, would this sort of take us back to the view we wanted to oppose, which is that loving the thing gives it moral status? Because obviously, here we would be the ones, so we assume that we have a right to decide over the properties of the thing over its extended lifetime. So in that sense, we are in fact, we have the sort of the power to give it moral status. So yeah, that's the question.
Okay, thank you. So the question is, I've said that I reject the view that in loving something, we give it moral status and that our attitudes to things can determine whether they have moral status. But isn't it true that our attitudes and decisions do determine whether things have moral status, on my view? If we decide to abort, we settle that something lacks moral status. If we decide to continue our pregnancies, we often make it the case that those things have, that the fetuses have moral status. If we decide that other people won't be able to abort, we make it the case that their fetuses have moral status, on my view. That's all true, yes. So it is true, on my view, that we determine whether things have moral status by determining things about what they're like, things about whether they are beings that experience consciousness or not. But we do have all these powers to affect the shape of the moral community. We decide whether to conceive babies or not, for example. And so I think that's right. We do affect whether things have moral status, but by affecting their properties, where independently we should think that the properties determine whether they have moral status. Thank you.
Hi, Joseph Moore. So I agree that the ever-conscious view gets the intuitively correct verdict in the case of someone who ceases to become or ceases to be conscious for humans, and maybe all the kinds of animals that we are aware of. But in the silly philosophical case vein, what if there was a kind of, let's call it a plant, but as soon as it shot up, like the first morning, it loved seeing the sunrise. And if you were to try to tear it up, it would be in immense pain. But then a minute after sunrise, would carry on with the normal life cycle of corn. I think, yeah, like it has moral status during that minute, but it would be totally fine to eat it, terminate it, whatever, while it's just normal corn.
Okay, thanks. So Joseph's question is, what if you had a weird plant that always had a brief experience of consciousness on its first day of full growth, like grows out, it grows from a seedling, and then it has a day of a minute of consciousness. And during that time, it can have either good or bad experiences, and we have moral reasons to be careful of it during that time. But then it just lives the life of a plant. And Joseph says, look, we could just treat it however we want in the ensuing time. So I think in the example, we're supposed to imagine that there's no way for it to have more consciousness. Because I do think if it has some consciousness and then there are things we could do to help it to have more experiences, that we would have reasons to do that. I don't know how strong they are. It might depend on other things. I think what I want to say about this is yes, so it is true on my view that this thing would have moral status throughout its life. But because it's such a different kind of thing from us, it is not clear what reasons we would have, like what would count as mistreating it, or how strong the reasons would be. And so I'm not too worried by this example. I think that it may be that we could kill it and eat it, because it might be that we think that's not bad for it. You know, one thing to say is that that's a really different kind of thing from an ordinary plant. So an ordinary plant, it's bad for it when you kill it, but I don't even know what to say about that thing. Thanks, Joseph.
One last question.
Hi, thank you. I'm Lucas. So my question is kind of a combination, I guess, of Tom's and Jeff's question. So I guess we can round it off with that. So I guess the basic worry that I have is your solution to the miscarriage case is that it would in fact be reasonable for these women to kind of think that these the fetuses are appropriate objects of love, and therefore their love is reasonable. I guess my concern is that it kind of implies that someone's like reasonable view about personal identity then has implications for when love is appropriate. So it kind of seems to imply like women who are like really convinced of psychological continuity, like unless you want to say that's like an unreasonable view, right? Then they ought to like feel less sad about miscarriages and that their love is then unreasonable for a miscarried child.
Okay, so the question is, if I'm getting it right, since I'm interested in questions of the reasonableness or the rationality of love of fetuses, isn't it going to matter what the pregnant woman's views are about identity over time and about moral significance? I think it does matter to questions of rationality and reasonableness what you think about these things. Absolutely. And that's part of why the really important normative claim that I want to make that we're going to learn from is a claim about whether people are making a mistake about whether, or making a mistake in principle about what's an appropriate object of love. Because the mere fact of reasonableness is just too weak a fact to really teach us anything. Because someone could be reasonable in loving the fetus because they've been brought up as a Catholic, and of course for Catholics it's reasonable to love the early fetus, but the reasonableness of loving the fetus when you're a Catholic doesn't tell us anything helpful, since many of us know that Catholicism is false. It can't be a surprise that I think that, having given this talk. But I don't tie anything about appropriateness to reasonableness. And so appropriateness really depends on how things actually are, morally speaking. Thanks. Thank you so much, everybody.
Now.